While Minnesota is commonly known as the land of 10,000 lakes, it is also a state of increasing cultural diversity. One of the state's largest ethnic groups is Somali, in which there are an estimated 30 to 50,000 people. Minnesota has the largest Somali population in the U.S. and has provided a new home to refugees, fleeing from persecution in their home country halfway around the world. As with any other people group, Somalis have a variety of legal needs and account for almost 3,000 cases in the Minnesota court system. However, unlike a lot of other ethnic groups, this group is at high risk for receiving poor language interpreting services in the courtroom. There are only 3 certified Somali language interpreters for the entire United States, so interpreting resources are stretched incredibly thin. Due to the shortage of certified Somali interpreters, Somalis often use friends as interpreters, or use non-certified interpreters who are not qualified in either English or the target language. These 2 options can be particularly dangerous because it only takes the mistranslation of a single word or phrase to change a person's understanding of their rights, sentence, or future.
This was a trial in Texas where this person was seeking asylum in the U.S. and he was denied the asylum, and I believe he was going through the appeal process, but he had 3 different interpreters throughout the process, and I think at least 2 of them did so poorly that his questions were not relayed properly, the answers were not relayed to the court properly. I don't think the interpreters grasped the legal terms that the judge was using. I don't think they could have relayed the Somali and the English. I don't think they could interpret it properly, is what I'm trying to say. So there were a lot of questions that made you think, had he had a good interpreter, not necessarily certified, but an interpreter that is qualified to do the work, I think he might have had a better chance maybe to, have his case heard.
We had, for example, a workers' compensation case where the witness had mentioned that he was working picking up soda cans, for example, and selling them. But in the context and the way he stated it first, he used a word that for me meant more like cans, like garbage cans, not soda cans, but garbage cans. So that would have had a very big impact on a workers' compensation case, obviously. So when I realized that there was an inconsistency there, then I properly, spoke to the judge and asked permission to clarify the term, and then I corrected it on the record. And those are the things that a family member will never do. Number 1, because they're afraid of speaking up in court. Number 2, because they don't know that they're supposed to do that. And number 3, because they might not even realize that they made a mistake.
The certification process is difficult. I went through it, and I thought, being a native Somali speaker and growing up speaking English, I spoke English as long as I can remember, through probably 2nd grade, 3rd grade. I grew up, in Kenya, where English is the official language. So I thought, I speak English just fine, and Somali is my native language, so that should not be a problem in interpreting in court. But when I took the certification exam, I got a wake-up call.
Anybody who is bilingual is not necessarily able to provide interpretation services.
If you don't go through the certification process, which I practiced for over a year, just to go through just the simultaneous and the consecutive interpreting, I practiced it for over a year, and it's tough to deliver the message if you're not on top of your game.
We strive to provide interpretation that is accurate, that is, we don't subtract or add anything to what any of the parties are saying. We are impartial.
It's very important to know that the interpreter is just a mode of transportation, transporting the message from from the speaker to the listener.
Friends and family make particularly poor interpreters because they often have vested interests in the outcome of the case, impacting their translation. Additionally, they may respond to sensitive information being transferred or offer unqualified advice, becoming a third party to the exchange instead of just being a communicator. Immigrants and limited English proficiency speakers often face additional challenges beyond translation in the courtroom, their cultural differences and register. Cultural differences in behavior and perception of the legal system can strongly influence what a person does and what they say in regards to their case. A person's register is the level of formality and sophistication in their speaking. It closely correlates with his or her educational background and can affect whether or not a person understands what they are being told, even if it's told perfectly in their dominant language. Even with certified interpreters, careful consideration of these factors need to be made for mutual understanding between the judge, attorneys, and LEP person involved.
The Somalis have a big mistrust, or they don't trust the court system in general. They don't trust any government because we've been oppressed by our own governments back home. That's why we're here, because of dictators that took over and then civil war broke.
They are refugees and they're afraid and they're very timid and they have a different respect for authority.
For example, if they get a speeding ticket and the police officer is going to show up to testify, they say that's it, it's the government, the court is the government, the police is the court, and I don't need to show up for this, I'll just pay the ticket.
They will normally agree to everything. Like you ask them a question, even though they're not understanding you, they'll nod and say, yes, yes, do you understand? Yes, yes, I do.
And in the U.S. civic class, or you would probably understand the difference between a judge and a jury. But you might have somebody that's fresh from Africa and we don't have some of that jury system. It's usually just a judge that listens to your case. And when you offer somebody, the judge says, you have the option to go to trial and your case can be heard, you have the option to be heard by a judge or a jury. It's very tough to explain that because they don't get the difference. Now, with the register itself, it's the wording. If the judge uses a complicated word or that an attorney uses a legal term that's hard for the average person, even not let alone a non-English speaking person, but an English speaking person might have a difficulty understanding a legal term. So if a judge uses a legal term and I go ahead and directly interpret that legal term, even in Somali, if they don't understand, if they don't have that education background or they don't have that exposure to the legal system, it might be difficult for them to grasp it. And so they might completely miss it.
While Minnesota has taken steps to improve the quality of interpretation offered in its courtrooms, having accurate interpretation is still not a guarantee. The Minnesota Judicial Branch website details the 4 requirements to be listed on the statewide roster as a non-certified interpreter, which are: to achieve a passing score on a written English proficiency test, to successfully complete the 2-day interpreter orientation program, to achieve a passing score on the multiple choice ethics and legal terminology test, and to file a written affidavit agreeing to be bound by the Code of Professional Responsibility for Interpreters. In small print, the website notes that non-certified interpreters have not had their interpreting proficiency evaluated, and there are no requirements or assessments that measure one's proficiency in Somali or any other foreign language.
So one of the most serious cases that I've seen personally regarding language provision was the state of Tennessee versus Song Hing. Ms. Hing was indicted on 3 counts of aggravated child abuse and 1 count of aggravated child neglect, I believe. In 2013, she had come and she was accompanied by her family, her spouse, and a pastor that was the one that was acting as an interpreter. The pastor spoke Burmese, but Ms. Hing allegedly spoke only Matu Chin, which is a dialect of Burmese, but it's not intelligible with Burmese, so she did not understand Burmese properly. She was, like I said, trusting her pastor, who was interpreting for her, or supposedly interpreting for her. The process went on. Eventually, she pleaded guilty. During that plea petition, the same interpreter was interpreting for her. So judge did a very good job at asking questions of the interpreter and finding if he had read the petition, if they had read the petition with the attorney, and if the attorney had explained all the questions that she may have had, and it was a long conversation between the judge and the alleged interpreter. Well, Ms. Hink pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 7 years, suspended, meaning on probation. But because she had an immigration detainer, an immigration hold, she was not to be released, but she was instead going to go in custody of ICE immigration. That actually went through. The judge actually asked throughout the plea petition if she knew, spoke with the attorney, and asked the attorney if she was aware of the immigration consequences. Everything was supposedly in order. She was indeed transferred to an immigration detention facility for deportation right after that. So in that process, another attorney comes in, and there is a motion for a post-conviction relief, which is based on inefficient assistance of counsel, which means another defense attorney comes in saying the previous attorney didn't do his job properly, or didn't do part of his job, or missed some part of the processing, and the case was not processed properly, and Ms. Hink was deprived from her constitutional right, which was to actually know what was going on with her. There were a series of court proceedings. Judge eventually requests what is called a transcription translation of the plea petition. So basically, that transcription translation, what it did is the interpreter wrote in one column everything that was said by the judge and by the interpreter in the proper language, English, Burmese, and then in the other column she would translate it into English so that we can understand what was said. So for example,
The judge said,
by pleading guilty, you are giving up your right to a trial and to call witnesses.
which was interpreted as,
This from the state, you what is it? For you to testify you must bring witnesses, must call witnesses.
the judge also said,
And are you pleading guilty to attempted aggravated child neglect?
interpreted as,
This you are saying of the charge request, it is not true that I reject the child. Are you wanting to submit that change, is that right? Are you submitting that I hit the child? Yes, I am wrong. Is that right?
and finally,
I'm going to find you guilty in count 3.
interpreted as,
I will say that you have said you are wrong, but I will let you go.
me being in the field and reading this, I can see that the interpreter or the person acting as the interpreter actually doesn't understand himself what the judge is saying. And again, there was no way for the judge to know that. There is no way for the attorneys to know that. The only way that we can actually determine that happened is by getting a transcription translation of that plea petition.
Poor interpretation is not limited to rare tongues like Somali or Matuchin, and can impact cases of all languages.
An Elkhart County man in prison for dealing cocaine near a school, getting his conviction thrown out.
Now, the Indiana Supreme Court ruling 5-0. Victor Ponce was not properly told about his rights when he pleaded guilty back in 1999. WSBT's Kelly Stepsinski is looking into how this decision could impact other cases. Kelly?
Rick, the High Court found the judge in this case did everything right, but the court-appointed interpreter inaccurately translated Ponce's rights to him in Spanish when he signed a plea agreement. The big question now, did she make the same mistakes in other cases?
The problem with cases with illegal immigrants, and many times when you're speaking with them, they're going to tend to agree when they don't really understand, just to be cooperative.
Mark Doty was Victor Ponce's lawyer 15 years ago. When his client pleaded guilty, Ponce's interpreter told the judge Ponce understood a little and spoke a little English. A certified court interpreter recently testified to Indiana's Supreme Court justices about court transcripts from that day. The judge said, Mr. Ponce, I now advise you that you have the right to a public and speedy trial by jury. The interpreter said he's advising you that you have the right to another judging speedier, okay? Then the judge said you cannot be compelled to make any statement or testify against yourself at any hearing or trial, but you may remain silent. The interpreter said, and until that date, you cannot make other oaths against yourself, but you can remain silent.
There have been a lot of illegal immigrants that have gotten in trouble in Elkhart County that probably utilize the same translator. I would imagine that some of those convictions could be in question.
If that's the case, the cases will be reviewed and we'll go from there. I mean, the bottom line is everybody is and particularly my office, is very interested in people being treated fairly.
It's not clear how many cases Ponce's interpreter was involved in, but she's no longer working for Elkhart County courts. And even though Prosecutor Curtis Hill was not in office back then, he says the system could have been better.
You had more of a haphazard system where is there anybody in the courtroom who can speak the language?
In 2003, the Indiana Supreme Court started a program that certifies and sets ethical standards for courtroom reporters, but courts in Indiana not required to have certified interpreters.
We may have hundreds of these cases in our legal system in the country because we have often people interpreting that are not certified, that are not tested for languages to determine which language they are actually speaking.